Well, hello, Lutheran Church of the Resurrection friends. This is Pastor Neal Hively, your pastor until the end of the year. Uh, Today, week number 4 in a series called Prayers That God is Most Likely to Say Yes to. And so today, it's on the topic of suffering. And here's the prayer: God, please help me through this time of pain, grief, and suffering. And why does God say yes to that? Because God will reveal God's divinity um, as He partners with us in these times of trial. One of the best attended and most enthusiastically supported Bible study I did in my parish ministry in Pennsylvania was on this topic of suffering, and that was 7 weeks. So in 12, 15 minutes, I'll try to cover some of the top points of that. And so why is the topic of suffering well received? Because it's an experience that everybody faces sometime. And we seek meaning, some sense of framework in which to place the suffering. Notice I didn't say in the prayer, God, make this go away. God, just take it away. Um, that doesn't happen. Suffering will happen to everybody. One aspect of life that is common to all of us is the shared experience of some sense of suffering, of going through trial or difficulty. It comes out of lots of different things in life, with disappointments and grief at the loss of a loved one or the loss of a dream, health issues, employment, family, friends, weather. There's lots of things that go on with this whole idea of tragedy and suffering. Um, in my parish in Pennsylvania, it was a downtown church, and people would come in off the street to the church office and want to tell their story, or sometimes they would ask for help. And the staff, whoever was there, would be the ones who would listen, sometimes would get discouraged. And I remind everybody, even faithful people, put on a happy face sometimes, even though they are broken. That everybody goes through trial and tribulation and suffering. Everybody is broken in some way. We all have pain and disappointment. Some need more direct help, and a kind listening ear is sometimes all someone needs to get them through. Some responses that I've heard given to people who are going through these times are not helpful. In fact, they can be offensive and they can be hurtful. So let me share a couple of things that don't work. If it's in your vocabulary, take it out. So you can make someone's suffering, somebody else's suffering, about you. I know just what you're going through. I had the very same experience. You're not listening. Their talking is not about you, it's about them. Or you can deflect their suffering. Oh, don't worry, it's all for the best. You'll get over it. That's not helpful. Or you can make it God's fault. Oh, it's God's will. You can make it their fault. You must have done something awful for God to punish you or afflict you in this way. All those are misleading and false, not helpful statements. Just erase those from your responses. Those responses, rather than being supportive, are like stab wounds to someone who's already hurting, and they just totally miss the mark. So the first thing I would say is suffering is universal. It happens to everybody sooner or later in one fashion or another. You can't deny it. You can't wish it away. We feel what we feel, and it's real. And our wishing for some reason or meaning for our suffering, to understand its reason or its purpose, is frustrating. We want to bring our suffering into some wider, comprehensive framework, and most often that ends in more frustration until perhaps much later in life, and then only looking back in hindsight. What we can do, and what I recommend, is invite God and invite others who are caring people to help us through. And God will say yes to that in partnering with us in getting us through. God, please help me get through this suffering. God will say yes, and it's often not immediate gratification. The pain, the emotional or physical, doesn't stop immediately. It's a partnership. God will partner with you and most often employ other people to be God's holy agents to walk with you through this episode. It takes whatever path it takes, whatever time it takes, um, that just takes its own course. Notice I did not say God will shield you or stop the suffering. God will see you through. Now, let's go back to the Bible for a minute. The Bible witness in Genesis with Adam and Eve is the early believers trying to put in some framework why bad things happen to good people. It's the human condition. Adam and Eve. We continue to choose to live apart from God. We make choices, mostly for ourselves. And God allows us to have free will to manifest itself in many ways. And evil, suffering, tragedy, and death, and all kinds of bad things are a result. God is not at fault. It's our choice. All that free will from billions of people infecting and affecting all creation flow together in this sort of mishmash to make a world culture in which we live, and sometimes it's not pleasant. Now, as an example, remember Jesus on the night of his betrayal prayed intensely to God, "If it is your will, let this cup pass from me." And then he added, "But not my will, but your will be done." That was, on Jesus' part, his determination to suffer to bring healing and good out of evil for all of us. Jesus, as divine, had foreknowledge of what was coming, and we don't know what's going to happen. But it's a universal truth. Suffering happens to all, but God provides a path through. God's presence with us lights a path out of dark despair and the hopelessness that suffering may bring. And that is what this heartfelt prayer provides. God, please be with me or see me through this suffering. You've may heard of read the poem Footprints in the Sand. I remember as a new pastor in the 70s, it was sort of the rage for a while. If you look it up on some of the online sites, there's been some dispute who the author of the poem may be, going all the way back to the 1930s. Let me just read that for you, because part of that, there is truth to this. And so here's Footprints in the Sand. Last night I had a dream. I dreamed I was walking along a beach with the Lord, and across the sky flashed scenes from my life. For each scene I noticed two sets of footprints in the sand, one belonging to me and the other to the Lord. After the last scene of my life flashed by, I looked back, and I saw footprints in the sand, and I noticed it many times along the path of my life, especially at the lowest and saddest times, there was only one set of footprints. This really troubled me, so I asked the Lord about it. "Lord, you said once I decided to follow you, you'd walk with me all the way. But I noticed during the saddest and most troubled time of my life, there was only one set of footprints. I don't understand why. When I needed you the most, you would leave me." And the Lord replied, "My child, my precious child, I love you. I would never leave you. During those times of suffering when you could only see one set of footprints, that was when I carried you." Now, that strikes a chord, and it resonates with us because it reveals a truth. We recall times of pain or grief or sorrow, and somehow we made it through, and along the way it felt as if we were carried by divine power, not our own. Now, there's also a point at which this poem, as wonderful it is, and the truth it reveals, it's not wrong, it's just incomplete. God doesn't do all the partnering or all the carrying in isolation. God employs willing people of God, sometimes even unlikely messengers and helpers, to walk with us on our journey. And too often I encounter folks who are angry with God because of life's trials. They didn't reach out to God, or they did not ask God's guidance. They even refused the willing friends and family who came to bring support. And because of that attitude, their life has turned dark. I firmly believe, and I've said this lots of times, even in sermons, one of Satan's most brilliant lies is, at these times, it was God's fault. How can a loving God allow this to happen? You've probably heard that before. But you see, it's not God's choice. It's our choice. The biblical witness is that the seed to the first sin came from Satan's planting doubt about who God is and who God is not. He whispered to Eve, "Eat the fruit and you will be like God." And so from Adam and Eve forward, we believe the lie. God didn't leave us. We left God. But God has not allowed us to be without guidance and hope. In the person of Jesus, God in the flesh, God came to show us and reveal the way out of despair. Since the consequence of separation from God is eventual physical death, the great promise now in Jesus is the gift of eternal life. And by raising Jesus from death to new life, what we call the resurrection, God demonstrated just how much the loving God is willing to be involved in our suffering, because God in Jesus suffered and died and was victorious and was raised to new life. It's only in the confines of the witness of the followers of the way of Jesus that suffering is acknowledged. Suffering is acknowledged as an abomination and evil and wrong, that the eternal God did intervene and bring life out of death, light out of darkness, and good out of evil. God does that in part with us in being a partner in our suffering. God will see you through many trials. And it's a theme that runs all through the Bible. And some of these Bible stories you'll go, "Oh, yes, I remember." How about Noah and the ark and the great flood? Jonah and the whale. The Hebrew children in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel in the lion's den. The Hebrew tribes traveling through the wilderness of Sinai. I can go on and on about all the witness of the Bible that people of faith appealed to God for direction, and God was faithful. They were all about trial and pain and suffering, and God prevailed. God partnered with us. And the people who were involved with those experiences counted them as good and worthy. Even though it appeared that they were a trial, God said it was beneficial. No matter how God chooses to address this prayer in your life, you will become aware of God's goodness and be the better for that. And your progress will be fuller and more rapid as you recover than without that divine partnership. Now, here's the last word. And this is not an eternal judgment, but it's my personal observation. One distinction between people of God and those who absent themselves from God is not the absence of suffering. Suffering happens to everybody, the good, the bad, the ugly, one degree or another. At some time in your life, you'll have an episode of trial and suffering. It is people of God go through these times with hope. Hope that the pain will end, hope in the assurance that God does have a plan for them, hope that someday their suffering will find meaning, and hope that God will bring good even out of the worst tragedies in life. Again, the reason God says yes to this prayer, "God, see me through this suffering," is that God always wants to self-reveal to those who desire it. God will help you through in ways you cannot even imagine. So here's the prayer again. God, please see me through this suffering. God's grace and God's peace be with you today. Amen.